things off, yeah, congratulations. I mean, one of the things that sort of fascinates me about you, Roddy, is that you also come from quite a kind of punky background. And I never sort of really believe the kind of punk versus prog thing. I think that's quite reductive, and I think you should be able to like everything. But obviously, stylistically, quite a gulf between those two influences. So, what drew you to Storm's work?
Well, before I was a punk in LA, this is late 70s, I was a rock guy, and I was in bands, and actually Pink Floyd on the Animals tour was the first show that I saw. My father drove us an hour and a half to Anaheim Stadium at 4 in the morning and dropped my friend and I off and said, "I'll see you in 17 hours. So, I had all those rock records, and then I became friends with a British drummer who landed in LA, and we started a punk band, and, sort of, cannibalized and went onward. But then very recently, Chris Brokaw, who scored my last film, before this, had said he was at Storm Thorgerson's studio, and he was friends with Dan Abbott, and I said, "Who's Storm Thorgerson? Is he a Finnish death metal singer?" And he said, "No, he had Hipgnosis, the record cover design company," and of course I knew their designs. And he said, "Yeah, he's still doing covers." And so I went online and I bought a great book that Powell and Storm had done called Walk Away Renee. It's been long out of print, but you guys should all get it and snatch it up. It's amazing. And it showed up in the mail, and I had a freak out as to how many covers they had done that had formed my teenage psyche. And so I got very, sort of obsessed with that idea that Storm was still doing covers in this way of building sets and props and shooting that. And then I was still working in 16mm film at the time. And I was also thinking about vinyl records disappearing in this thing. So I thought the intersection of those things was an interesting sort of topic. So I ended up having to buy back all those records to have them and look at them. But it was great, research for film buying records. You can't go wrong with that. So.
Absolutely. And Orian, hello. It's great to meet you. I mean, how did you come to be involved with the project? And because obviously you have you worked with Reduce Control, and you also have a kind of sort of rock and roll background. But so how did you come to start working with Roddy on this project?
Roddy and I met. Can you guys hear? Yeah. Through a mutual friend. How long? We always forget the exact moment in time, but we were put in touch with each other, and he was working on this documentary about Storm. And I love music and I love photography, and growing up in Mississippi and Texas, you're kind of isolated from certainly this country and a lot of the artists that I loved. And we met, and he says, "I want you to come on board and help me out, and kind of see this through to the end." And it was an immediate yes. And there's some other things that we've been talking about since, but I love music and I love photography, and I love, all we had growing up in Houston, it sounds like it was 100 years ago, it wasn't, but it was, these vinyl covers, and some of the magazines would come through, certainly, to some of the bookstores in Texas and Mississippi, but all we had was those images, so I was always fascinated with it.
Yeah, they're totally fascinating, and I think especially now, seeing them, and in this era where everything's so miniaturized and throwaway in a way, is that they're all the more precious, I think. Aubrey, I'm fascinated by the process of everything being absolutely real. Everything, there's no mock-up, there's no photoshopping. This is, often with sort of great risks involved. Apparently, I mean that must have made for some quite eventful and expensive shoots, I would imagine.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say before I answer that question is I'd like to thank Roddy, because I found that a very emotional experience watching that film. I haven't seen that film in 4 years. Storm and I went to Berlin to do an exhibition there. It was the first time I'd seen the film. And I have to say, I couldn't take it in so well at that time, and Storm was quite ill then. And today, it's a wonderful piece. And it's a great accolade to Storm and myself and to Peter at Storm Studios, and I'd like to thank you for that. Storm, what was your question? I'm more interested in the red socks, the red stuff. It's all very red.
Very
What's going
much.
on here?
Absolutely. It's tied to my personal tribute to all the red balls. to talk about those kind of recurring themes. But yeah, so basically kind of talking about just doing everything absolutely for real, often at sort of great cost and maybe with sort of personal risk.
I think more to the point was, I can only speak for Hipgnosis' period of work, and of course Peter experienced Storm later on. But the issue is really we had no choice, because there was no Photoshop, there was no digital apparatus that we could work with. So when we wanted to shoot red balls in the desert, which naturally now you could do easily digitally, we had no choice but to take the balls and inflate them and put them in the desert. And that was a lot harder than you think, because first of all, taking 60 red footballs which were deflated, arriving in the Sahara Desert and wondering with a bicycle pump how you do that was kind of complex. And realizing after 2 hours of puffing and blowing and only having blown up 3 footballs, this was not going to happen. So, for example, we found a truck stop in the middle of the Sahara and persuaded the guy for $10 to blow up the footballs, all 60 of them, and came back the next morning fully prepared for them not to be done, only to find about 40 very tired children with bicycle pumps blown up on these child labour footballs, and we were amazed. And we took the balls, took them out to the desert, and we had something which we always called the Hipgnosis vibe. And for some reason we were blessed. I don't know why. We were blessed with light. And that you see in many of Storm's pictures, not just with Hipgnosis, but the later pictures too, that somehow the light and the locations always worked for us. And for example, the red balls in the desert you saw there, I mean, it was one evening and it was silent and flawless and magical and just a moment which I will never forget, and Storm certainly never forgot, and it was the first time we really created a surreal picture like that. And everything just fell into place, and somehow, when that magical moment happens to you, you realise that's why you're doing it for real. And I think those early years gave us that momentum and gave us that inspiration that everything should be done as real as possible. There should be no fakery. And that's what we started with, and Storm went on, of course, with Storm Studios to carry on that tradition and get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until he was building enormous statues made out of metal.
Even with Photoshop, we were still doing it for real.
That's what I was going to ask you, Peter,
There you
as
go.
well, because of course you run Storm Studios now, and
With Rupert and Dan.
with Rupert and Dan who are here tonight, I gather. You know, how obviously you must be staying very true to the sort of the Storm spirit, and presumably still doing everything for real and doing it that way.
Yeah, well, just recently, a year or two ago, we did a shoot, not with hundreds of balls, but we took a massive, great 20-foot black ball to the Californian desert. But it's that thing of doing it through, and like Post says, catching that light and that moment. You'd spend all day walking around the location, trying to find the right spot, and then you kind of hoping that the weather's going to stay as it is, because as soon as it's gone, and you can't get it back. So it is, you realise at that point that you've got to, and you just kind of. But that doesn't stop you carrying on trying to take more. You still, there's something that Storm instilled, was you kind of, you push and push and push and go as long as possible, get as much out of the day as you possibly can, especially when you travel to somewhere like California, because you're only there for 2 or 3 days, you know, so you have to get as much as you can. And that's when people started to keel over.
I was going to say, there is the image that's in the hall that Poe shot of the sheep on the psychoanalyst couch.
Yeah.
And it was shot in Hawaii, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of Storm and I working very well together. We had a very volatile relationship, I have to say, and from the film, you know, and especially when I look at myself being so naive and silly with long hair and spotty and sort of funny little beard, and speaking very, very sort of, not very coherently about the work, I find it slightly embarrassing. But actually, the relationship with us was incredibly good. We worked, Storm very much was an ideas person, and I was very much the person who put the style and the photography into it. However, we had a very volatile relationship, and often Hasselblads would be flying across the studio and rage at each other. But the beauty of it was forgotten in a flash. Within a couple of hours, we were moving on to what was
That's the
more
same as
important
anyone.
work.
It wasn't anyone who worked with Storm had that.
I
You stayed with
think-
him. You went through that. It wasn't all the time.
But you were mentioning one cover particularly, which was the
10cc.
Yeah. And that's a very good example where we worked together. Because Storm had a son at home, he didn't often venture out to do photography. So that was left to me. Storm came up with the idea of the sheep on the couch, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. We went to see Graham Gordon, of course, who's here tonight, and said, we want to do this. And he said, why can't you do it in Canberra Sands? You know, it's down the road, the sea's there. And Storm, being Storm, said, it's impossible. We have to have Sunset Beach in Hawaii because the waves are so big. Well, the waves were, 3 miles out, they weren't. But anyway, he managed to persuade. Well, the only thing I'll say is never work with sheep and never work with psychiatrist couch, because when I got to Hawaii, there are no psychiatrists in Hawaii and there's no couches there. So I had to spend a week getting a psychiatrist couch built and then finding a sheep. Well, there are no sheep in Hawaii either. They didn't exist. So luckily, I found a university that had a sort of very small zoo. And in that zoo were 3 sheep. So we took the most unsuspecting one, so a sheep like being near the sea. Took them down to the beach, put him on the couch, put the sheep on there, and of course, as soon as the waves came in, he immediately jumped off and ran away. We brought in a sheepdog. That didn't work either. But because of our experiences with drugs of various sorts through our youth, I realised that Valium was the answer. So, that poor unsuspecting sheep, and if you look at that cover, that sheep is glaring at me. He's sitting down and he's got this like, fuck you. Look. But a couple of Valium did the trick. And I always remember, because there was no mobile phones then, you've got to remember, no Facebook or anything like that. So I remember calling, long distance to Storm in London. He's saying, hey man, have you got it? And me going, yeah, I think so. It's kind of, it looks kind of weird, but it is the sheep on the couch and the waves with it. And he said, you fucking better have. And luckily we had, and it was a great shot. But it is a perfect example of Storm coming up with an idea, sketching it out to me going away and creating the style of it and photographing it. And that's why our relationship works so well together. We just clicked like that. And he was a beautiful man.
It's kind of magical collaboration, and
Yeah.
I mean it's interesting, sort of picking up on what you mentioned about sort of volatility of Storm, and it sort of seems like a perfect example of nominative determinism, sort of being called Storm and being quite sort of stormy character sometimes. I wonder, sort of from your point of view, Roddy and Orian working with him on this film. I mean, obviously built up a very intimate relationship with him. Obviously, really trusted you. But what were there any challenges that came up, or was he totally kind of how did it all develop?
I mean, the one thing I would say, it's hard for me to watch the film, actually. I mean, I watched, it just had a run in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. I watched a couple of the screenings, so tonight I sort of ducked out. It's very emotional because we did become very close in the film, and I'm glad that sort of comes through, and I have to credit the editor a lot with that, Karen Skloss, who did a great film about Townsend and Zant, the country singer, and I sort of hounded her to cut this film. But yeah, he was a very intense character, and I met him after he had his stroke, but before he had his cancer diagnosis. And even with his stroke, everybody was exhausted, and he would still be going, and I was just amazed. The first time I shot him, actually, he said, okay, Roddy, I'm going to stand here, and you shoot there, and you pan to me, and then I'll tell the story. And I sort of put the camera down and I said, Storm, I know you don't know a lot of my movies, but I never pan shots. And I was messing with him, of course. And he said, what? What do you mean you don't pan a shot? How will they know I'm here? And I said, sorry. And then the next time we were doing a shot, he said, where do you want me? And I think things sort of flipped. And there's a scene in the end where he's getting his hair washed. And I think that was the moment where things really shifted, where about an hour before he had an opening for a show in Los Angeles, he said, I want to get my hair washed. You have to take me, Roddy. And I said, well, only if you let me film it. And he said, why would you want to film that? So we drove around West Hollywood and we could only find a woman's hair salon. And Storm, being the charmer that he is, talked them into doing his hair. So we're the only men in there. And when I was shooting that, I think he realized that our relationship was a little bit different. He never looked at the movie until it was finished. He said, "This is your film, Roddy." So I think he understood that it shouldn't be a vanity project. That it was really, I think it had to be bigger than that. I think initially we started being about, design work, and I think that's incredible. It's also really embedded in the film. But also, I think he was surprised that we were able to flesh out, kind of him and my dynamic, which I think also people respond to the thing about vinyl records in a similar way.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, there's obviously a huge amount of trust there. You can totally see that, and it's an interesting reflection, I think, of the trust that bands and artists have in Storm, in Hipgnosis, in Storm Studios. That there's a lot of trust, and I think it's really interesting. Because in most cases, I suppose, even the Peter Gabriel one where his face is actually on the cover, there's a kind of demand that the artist maybe puts his ego aside, which is quite, it's not just a sort of band leaning up against a brick wall looking mean, it's, it's the absolute opposite of that.
Some bands.
Some bands, tell me. Tell us more. Expand.
Well, I have to say that, it comes across in the film that, things were relatively easy in our relationships with the bands. And I have to say, I think because the work that we did, that most of the artists we worked with, we were almost like the fifth wheel on the car. We travelled with the bands, we stayed with the bands, we worked with the bands. It was a very intimate relationship with all the people we worked with. And there was this trust, this kind of renegade trust. We're one of you, we're outside the law, we don't work for the record companies, fuck them, we don't do advertising, all that sort of vibes. That made us part, as Robert Plant expresses it very well, made us part of it. But it wasn't always so easy, I have to say. Roddy's film makes it look like we were like, have an idea, it's all wonderful. And there's a story that I'm going to tell, which is a classic which many may know, but I never forget it as well. We were going to see Led Zeppelin about an album cover, and Storm was always slightly devious. And when we got there, I remember him shoving into my arms an idea amongst the other ideas that I hadn't seen before and I didn't understand. He said, just put it out, just put it out. So anyway, I laid the ideas out around the room, and they were looking around, and there was this one drawing, and it was a picture of a tennis racket on a piece of grass, and we got to it, and I remember Jimmy saying, "What's that?" And Storm said, "Well, it's a racket." And I remember Jimmy saying, "Are you inferring that Led Zeppelin make a racket?" And Storm went, "Jim, you got it." And we were hastily shown the door. I didn't get the job. So it wasn't always plain sailing, and I was furious when I got outside. What the fuck do you do? Anyway, that was very typical Storm to slip something in. It was a surprise, but that was part of his charm.
Yeah, a lot of wit and a lot of sort of playfulness, and that obviously comes through in the art.
Not everybody got it. Paul
I'm
McCartney
sure.
never got our playfulness, I'll tell you that.
Right. I mean, we talked, as you mentioned just now, Roddy, about the sort of the vinyl, the decline in vinyl, and all this sort of. I may be an impossible idealist, but I sort of refuse to believe that.
Can I just say, the last 2 years, I've done about 20 to 25 artworks with vinyls.
Right.
So it's
coming back.
It's coming back.
That's such a
It's in
relief.
a small part, but it's coming back.
Oh,
I think people are buying physical products rather as well as a download. So
We're just working together, which is interesting. Us working together on a box set for Pink Floyd, which is a release of 27 vinyl albums.
Wow.
So there is, and if you go to any store in America now, Target or I don't care, John Lovatis, wherever it is, people have got record players for sale.
Yeah.
It's a big resurgence.
That's a great thing to hear, because it's just, I certainly feel that, people, I think maybe there's a resurgence of feeling that vinyl's very special, and maybe because we have all these other formats as contrast, and, we can still see vinyl as a piece of art, maybe it's even more special now, because it's not so ubiquitous. But there's a quote in the film, I think it's Storm says, ideas don't suffer from size restriction, which I think is a really positive thing to say. I mean, would you agree with that? What's your take on that?
No, well, you can't think about the size, you just have to think about the idea and the image. And that's what I was thinking about when Powell was telling the 10cc story. Was that picture of the sheep on the cover, if I'm right, Graham, was about that big? All that trip to Hawaii, you've got this 12-inch cover, and that picture of the sheep is about that big.
How dare you tell them that?
It's such a great picture, and you think all that work that went into it, and it's just like,
I think,
God.
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in the United States, the vinyl plants are behind 6 to 8 months, but, you know, they're expanding, but you think compared to what it was, it's, you know, it is starting up again. I mean, my take on it is that I hope this film's, you know, is the endpoint for something new that happens, because I think, you know, with all the technology, and you see it in gaming culture, online gaming culture, I think the more people are isolated, you know, the more the object and the idea of something that brings people together is becoming relevant again. So it's an interesting idea. I mean, when the film is screened, I think people, they don't seem nostalgic, but they seem to be sort of energized around the idea of, okay, you know, playing something to each other, as opposed to copying over your iPod library where you never listen to, you know, an 18th of the material is interesting.
Yes, these are interesting times. I think we're coming into an interesting new era now. I've just been given the signal. I'm running back out of time, but I'm sure there are people fizzing with fabulous questions in the audience. I see a lady with her hand up with the orange top. Is there a mic?
That was a really great film, and I think everybody from any generation in this room is going to take something away very personal from that. Will it be available to buy at any point at all?
Yeah, it's coming out on DVD and streaming probably early November. There's a website for the film if you Google it. It's taken by stormfilm.com. Orian and I, one of the things we talked about is to self-distribute the film, because I took about a year of meetings, and the film and distribution world is worse than the record industry right now. So we decided, you know, we would go on the road and try and do events and exhibitions and book things. So that's the plan. And we'll just see. We'll roll the dice and just go for it.
Okay.
So, thanks.
Sorry, my main question is actually thank you, for Peter and Poe. As creatives yourselves, and working with someone who is undoubtedly a genius in his own way, very charming, but as you said yourselves, very volatile, how was it for you as creatives to try and put your own ideas forward and your own stamp on things and your own input?
Quite difficult. No, there was lots of arguing, wasn't there? Lots of debate, lots of toing and froing.
I'll make a quotation which was given by Ringo Starr when they asked Ringo Starr, how, you know, did he write any songs? And he said, yes, I did. I wrote loads of songs. And I walked into Abbey Road and I said to Paul and John, listen to this. And Paul said, that's great, now listen to this, and played him yesterday. It was a very similar kind of situation. I'd often say to Storm, hey, no, that's a great idea, you know, and you go, yeah, that's so right. And I go, oh, shit.
Anybody else got any questions? There's a gentleman here in the t-shirt.
You know, these album covers, they're all on computer now. Would there be any call for you animating any of these covers for use on the computer? Just a short animation, revisiting some of your previous works.
To be quite frank, I'm very protective of Hipgnosis work, and I had a different view from Storm. Storm was very much one of getting the work out there for everybody to see, and did endless exhibitions and stuff like that. And since Storm passed on, I'm not like that. I rather keep the work back a little bit. I think it's been overexposed, and I would like to think that actually the work will go on to have a greater meaning in the kind of creative art world. And I'm looking more to be more selective about where it's shown and how it's done. And that's why I'm so pleased about this film, because I feel it is a selective view of the work. And I'm not terribly keen, I mean things are offered all the time to use the imagery as part of the media these days all the time. And I back away from that. I think, to me, the work is very personal and very, I don't want to sound pretentious, but I think it's culturally important and historically important and shouldn't just be thrown away. As I said in the film, there is a great dichotomy between, is it commercial art or is it real art? Is it pop art? And the way that Storm and I operated, I tend to feel that it was a very dedicated piece of work and therefore deserves more than just creating stuff like animated films for the sake of doing it. And I'd rather work in a little more selective way. But that's a personal thing.
Really quickly, I would say that Poe and Storm were film students. And to me, one of the things that I told them when I first met them was that some of the Hipgnosis covers look like film stills already. So that's what's sort of interesting about them. They seem like they're between a scene that's happened before, like Into the Outdoors, something like that, something afterwards. So I think they already sort of do that in a way, but they do it in your mind. So when you're listening to the music, you're looking at the cover, it shifts, I think. So I think it's already sort of done that. You know, I don't see a reason to animate the flames on the businessman or something like that. It seems like it's already doing that, but in your imagination.
Can I just say something about Storm also? This is no reflection on Roddy, but there is a part of the film that doesn't come through, and it's a part of the film that Storm should be recognised for, is that he was a brilliant film director. He should have gone on to be a film director, in my view, and not gone back to still pictures. And I think probably the breakup of him and I, when Greenback Films was happening and it imploded, actually scared him off from that. And it was a great shame, and I regret it to this day that we didn't go on further and didn't manage to cement our relationship back to go on to do serious films. Because if you watch some of his videos, which you can access on YouTube, things like Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes, his direction is flawless, his camera moves are extraordinary. He took what we were doing in album covers into another dimension. And I thoroughly recommend you check it out. That's where, in a way, he should have been headed, and it didn't happen because he was a great director.
We have time for one more question. There we are, in the black jumper. My husband. It's not favouritism.
Thank you, thanks. I just wondered if I could ask, kind of in like a ballpark kind of area, I'm quite curious, how much did things actually cost? Can you say any numbers?
And Gordon's in the room, I'm not going to say. Well, towards the heydays of album covers, I mean, there's no question that between 1967, when we started, and Peter Blake started album cover design, really, with the Sgt. Pepper's for the Beatles, from that period, the Halcyon days were through to 1982. And at 82, Hipgnosis stopped because CDs were coming in, punk was coming in, we could see the writing on the wall. Jamie Reed's Never Mind the Bollocks, because the Sex Pistols must have cost £2. We had done an album cover, which was Wish You Were Here, which I had photographed most of it, and Storm's ideas. I would say we spent £50,000. And that, in those days, was a lot of money. And, but, you know, you've got to put it in context. Dark Side of the Moon sold 65 million copies. Led Zeppelin probably sold 400 million albums. They had money to burn. Everything was private jets, best hotels, one of the best album covers. How much is it going to cost? What's the problem? And we weren't being paid by the measly record companies. We were being paid by the bands. So in its heyday, an album cover could cost £50,000. And that's it, that money then. Probably 250,000 now.
Thank you.
You'd be lucky to get £3,000 now.
Well, before we wrap things, I just have one more question, because Roddy and Orian, you're working together again on a new project. Would you like to mention it?
Yeah, we can talk about it briefly.
Share what you wish to.
Before Storm passed away, we had sort of talked about doing a project on Syd Barrett, and Storm said to me, "Do you want to do a film about Syd?" And it was after we had screened the film in Los Angeles, this film that Rob Dickinson and Catherine Will approached Storm and said, Roddy should do the movie. Look at the film he did on you. And so I knew, of course I knew a lot about Syd Barrett from being in bands when I was in college. But I told Storm I needed some time, and I bought all the biographies and the documentaries that are out. And I said, you have to give me 3 months or 2 months to go through this stuff. And I thought the projects were pretty superficial, well done, sort of television style things. But I thought there was a more interesting story potentially there. So Storm and I started doing this documentary. Janie Spires was here, was very key to helping us, and there's a lot of Storm and Poe's friends from Cambridge that are in the film. So it's a little bit different in terms of, the approach. It's really from the friends' memories, and so it's, I'm not quite sure how the film's going to take a turn because Storm passed away before it was done, and now I'm completing it. So I joke that Storm's finally got me to work for him. And Orian's come on as a producer to help finish this, so we're very excited about it. I think the material is very interesting, and it's a complex story. So I think, and no one knows the real answer, so that's part of the interest of it for me as a director.
It's a story that's obviously in very safe hands, so looking forward to seeing that. I could talk to you guys all night, unfortunately we've run out of time, but please show your appreciation for Peter, Aubrey, and Roddy.